2 centuries ago, when the British Empire wanted someone to vanish from their world, they sent them to the farthest edges of the map. An isolated island in the middle of the ocean, where harsh nature itself became a prison. Today, the chains have long vanished, revealing a land beyond imagination. Ancient volcanoes standing silently as if sealed by time. Predators, named for the devil himself, still roaming the dense forests. And along the coastline, granite rocks glowing in vivid shades of orange. In the shadows of the past, the stories of exiled humans, of merciless nature, and of desperate escape attempts converge into a single name. This is Tasmania, a place born of punishment, yet ultimately transformed into paradise. For thousands of years, the Palawa people traveled across these coastal waters, living in harmony with the land and the ocean. But in 1803, the British arrived with a very different vision. Before them lay a wild peninsula, with sheer cliffs, narrow, blade-like strips of land, and swirling, treacherous waters. To an empire, it was the perfect space for confinement. Tasmania became a place of exile for those deemed beyond redemption. Not merely criminals, but people society sought to erase entirely. Here, the natural landscape itself became the prison walls. At Port Arthur, stone structures rose like medieval fortresses. Yet the true severity did not lie in stone and steel, but in the control of the mind, a surveillance system that ensured prisoners never knew if they were being watched. A forced silence pervaded every activity. Men worked 8 and slept in utter quiet for years. Some prisoners lost their sanity, while others tormented themselves with impossible escape plans. Today, as night falls, ghostly tour guide visitors through the ruins. Amid the darkness and ancient walls, they feel a chilling unease, hear inexplicable sounds, and sense a presence that lingers. Perhaps not everything that was ever imprisoned has truly disappeared. The history people once tried to forget, combined with timeless natural beauty, leaves every visitor both awestruck and silently reflective before the story of this land. Yet Tasmania was never defined solely by confinement. Beyond stone walls and enforced silence, the island carries a far older memory, one that existed before exile, before surveillance, before punishment itself. It is not a memory of control, but a memory of movement. For thousands of years, the Palawa people moved freely along these shores, reading land and ocean as a single, living whole. When night fell, small fires were lit upon the sand, not as warnings, but for survival. They cooked, gathered, and waited quietly at the water's edge, as humans have done since the beginning of time. When British ships entered these waters in the 18th century, the first thing they saw was not cliffs or hostile shores. From offshore, they saw lines of fire stretching along the coastline, silently glowing in the darkness. To the sailors, it marked the edge of the world. To this land, it was just another ordinary night. The fires would eventually fade. Empires would arrive and then disappear. But the coastline would remain. Today, granite boulders still glow orange against white sand and clear blue water, slowly stained by lichen, sea air, and time. This stretch of coast is preserved not to erase history, but to remember what existed long before prisons were built. To the Palawa, this place is Larapuna. The world would later come to know it as the Bay of Fires. Leaving the fires of the northern coast behind, the journey continues south toward a bay whose name feels almost too poetic to be true. From above, its crescent shape mirrors the curve of a wine glass. But this name was not born from beauty, nor from leisure, it came from blood. Long before maps and romantic interpretations, this peninsula belonged to the Paidaram people of the Oyster Bay Nation. For tens of thousands of years, they lived between forest and sea, walking paths that still exist today. In the early 19th century, European explorers arrived. French navigators charted the coastline. Soon after, whalers followed. For 2 decades, small boats entered the bay, harpooning whales offshore and dragging their bodies back to land. Blubber was boiled for oil, bones shipped to Britain. The water turned dark, stained red, and the bay earned its name. When the whales vanished, others came, grazing, mining, extraction. The land endured again, slowly deteriorating, until protection finally arrived. Declared a national park in 1916, the peninsula began to heal. Forests returned, wildlife reclaimed the coast. Today, wombats roam beneath eucalyptus trees, sea eagles circle above, and whales once again pass offshore alive. This is Wineglass Bay, a place where beauty conceals memory and paradise was reclaimed, not given. Leaving Wineglass Bay behind, the coastline begins to change. Sand gives way to rock, and the land slowly rises from the sea. Granite mountains appear almost without warning, their soft pink tones shaped by minerals and time. The hazards stand close to the water, compressing the landscape as if the island is holding itself together. Long before it became a national park, people moved carefully between forest and shore. Then came whaling, grazing, and mining, leaving marks that did not fade easily. The damage did not arrive in a single moment, but accumulated over many years. By the early 20th century, the strain had become unmistakable. In 1916, Freycinet was protected, and extraction came to a halt. That pause changed everything. Forests thickened again. Rare plants clung to narrow granite crevices. Wildlife adapted, and some species quietly returned. Today, despite the number of visitors, Freycinet still holds its silence, narrow trails, sheltered coves, and sudden stillness between wind and water. This is not untouched wilderness. It is a land that was used, worn down, and then given back to time. And it is time that made the difference. And as the land slowly began to heal, something else changed as well, the way people returned. No longer as deep cuts into the earth, but as footsteps learning how to stay. Not pushing further into the peninsula, but stopping at its edge. Where the mountains close in and the sea opens once more, a small community began to take shape, quietly and patiently. This is where Freycinet meets everyday life. Before becoming a place for visitors to pause, Coles Bay was shaped by hard labor, from offshore whaling and hillside mining to small pastoral communities clinging to the edge of the bay. Today, abandoned mine shafts and weathered huts still remain, softened by grass and sea wind, like traces of a time when people came here to extract, not to rest. When Freycinet was declared Tasmania's first national park in 1916, extraction came to an end and the rhythm of life shifted. Decades later, a small town formed not to impose itself on the landscape, but to live alongside it. Even now, Coles Bay remains modest in scale, guarding the entrance to the peninsula. From the shoreline, the hazards rise in pink and red granite, almost unchanged. Life here moves slowly, and the town chose restraint early, becoming one of the first to ban plastic bags, a quiet proof that people can live more lightly. Coles Bay is not a destination. It is a threshold, a place where people pause, live, and enter Freycinet with care. Leaving the east coast behind, the journey turns toward Tasmania's remote northwest, where the land begins to feel heavier with time. Here, the story stretches far beyond human memory. Rising abruptly from the coastline near the historic village of Stanley is a shape that feels almost deliberate, flat-topped, steep-sided, and impossible to ignore. Millions of years ago, molten magma cooled inside an ancient volcano, forming a hard core that resisted erosion while the surrounding landscape slowly wore away. What remains today is a striking volcanic plug, once known as Circular Head, standing firm against wind and ocean. Long before European arrival, this land belonged to the Northwest Tasmanian Aboriginal people, often associated with the name Munatrick. Later, the formation earned its enduring nickname, perhaps because it was a hard nut to crack, or because its deeper origins were never fully understood. Below its cliffs, farmland spread outward and a small community took shape, with the nut becoming the constant backdrop to daily life in Stanley. Today, visitors ascend its slopes on foot or by chairlift, reaching a wide plateau that opens into sweeping views of Bass Strait, surrounding farmland and distant national parks. More than a viewpoint, the nut stands as a reminder of Earth's patience, a landmark shaped by deep time, quietly watching generations come and go. Continuing north, along Tasmania's east coast, the landscape begins to break apart. The shoreline no longer feels continuous, and reaching a place sometimes becomes a matter of waiting. When the tide retreats, a narrow strip of sand briefly appears, temporarily linking the mainland to a small granite island just offshore. In that short moment, the boundary between land and sea opens, then quickly closes again. This place is not defined by height or scale, but by interruption. Access has never been permanent, and that uncertainty has kept the island largely beyond human use. Instead of being claimed, it became a point of return for marine life. Each year, little penguins move between ocean and land, using the island as a fixed marker along a constantly shifting coast. To locals, it is known as Cod Rock. On maps, it appears as Diamond Island, not a destination, but a pause, reminding us that along Tasmania's east coast, not every place is meant to be held, and not every connection is meant to last. Beyond this brief interruption, the coast continues its quiet progression northward. It bends, waits, and adapts, carrying the story onward, one fragment at a time. Leaving the coast behind, the journey turns inland, where Tasmania gradually rises and movement begins to slow. The air grows colder, and the land becomes harder to reach. For a long time, this highland interior was not something to be conquered, but something to be skirted around. It offered little ease and few immediate rewards. As extraction expanded across other parts of the island, the highlands remained on the margins of attention. It was here, in the early 20th century, that a different idea briefly surfaced, that not every landscape needed to be used. A single peak came to represent that hesitation. Cradle Mountain was not preserved because it was convenient, but because someone argued that it should be left alone. That argument did not end development overnight, but it altered the direction of thought. Over time, Cradle Mountain came to be seen not simply as a mountain, but as a marker where Tasmania first slowed down, turned inward, and began to reconsider how land should be treated before moving further on. At the base of Cradle Mountain, the land eases into a hollow shaped by ice. Dove Lake lies here as a remnant of the last ice age, formed when glaciers retreated and left behind a still basin beneath the mountain. Long before it was mapped or named, this lake was part of a broader glacial system that carved Tasmania's central highlands. In the early 20th century, as interest in Cradle Mountain grew, Gustav Weindorfer named the lake after a company official, anchoring it within the emerging idea of protection rather than exploitation. In 1940, the park's first ranger, Lionel Connell, built a small boat shed on the lake's edge, using local timber and simple design. It was not meant to attract attention, only to serve those managing the park. For decades, rowboats rested there, quietly marking a period when access was allowed, but development was restrained. The structure remains largely unchanged, a subtle record of how early conservation was practiced: practical, limited, and cautious. Surrounded by ancient vegetation and wildlife, adapted to cold and isolation, Dove Lake became more than a scenic foreground to Cradle Mountain. It became a place where Tasmania's early conservation ideals were tested in practice, not by what was added to the landscape, but by how little was changed. As the road climbs west of Hobart, the forest begins to change. Ferns thicken, trees rise higher, and the air cools with altitude. Mount Field was one of the first places in Tasmania where nature was protected not because it was remote, but because it was visibly fragile. Long before the idea of wilderness carried global meaning, this landscape had already been shaped, first by ice, then by water, and later by human hesitation. During the last ice age, glaciers carved broad valleys and shallow basins across the plateau, leaving behind tarns and cirque walls that still define the park today. In 1885, the area around Russell Falls was set aside as Tasmania's first nature reserve, an early recognition that some places should be preserved before they are exhausted. By 1916, Mount Field was declared a national park, formalizing a shift already underway. The forest carries that history quietly. Towering eucalypts rise from valleys once scoured by ice. Alpine plants cling to ground, shaped by cold and wind. Even species that vanished elsewhere, like the thylacine, left their final traces in this region. Mount Field does not present itself as a single landmark, but as a layered record where geology, climate, and early conservation decisions intersect, marking one of Tasmania's first attempts to slow human impact and allow natural systems to endure on their own terms. From the cool rainforests and cascading rivers of Mount Field, the story does not simply stop at the forest's edge. As protection efforts shifted from remote valleys to the landscapes closest to human settlement, another presence quietly dominated the horizon. Rising directly above Hobart, a mountain had long shaped how people understood land, weather, and limits. Long before streets and settlements spread across the estuary below, this summit was formed through ancient geological processes, as seabeds were gradually uplifted and magma intruded into layers of rock, unfolding tens of millions of years before humans appeared. Columned cliffs and a broad, flattened summit remain, clearly recording that process. For centuries, the mountain carried multiple names, each reflecting how it was perceived rather than what it was. European explorers renamed it repeatedly Skiddaw, Table Mountain, Montagne du Plateau, until in 1832 the name Mount Wellington was fixed, commemorating a European victory unrelated to the land itself. Over time, the mountain took on additional roles. Whether stations were placed near the summit, roads were cut during periods of economic hardship, fire erased human-built structures, and forests returned where they could. In 1836, the mountain's meaning came fully into focus when Charles Darwin climbed to the summit and recorded his observations of forests, rock, and climate layered by elevation. This is Cunniney/Mount Wellington, not a wilderness discovered far from people, but a constant reminder that Hobart exists beneath the shadow of a landscape far older, harsher, and operating beyond human rhythms. Seen from above, the city appears small. From the summit, Hobart is compressed into the curve of an estuary, its streets and rooftops arranged along the River Derwent as if shaped by the water itself. It is here, beneath the constant presence of the mountain, that Tasmania's most enduring settlement took form. Long before it became a city, this shoreline functioned as an anchoring point, deep, sheltered, and accessible, drawing ships into the river and people onto the land. In 1804, Hobart was established not as a center of ambition, but as a penal outpost, its early growth tied to confinement, whaling, and maritime trade rather than expansion inland. The port connected the island to distant oceans, while the mountain behind it set a natural limit, shaping how far the settlement could spread. Over time, Hobart moved through cycles of growth and contraction, marked by booms, fire, war, and isolation. Streets were rebuilt, bridges collapsed and rose again, and the city adapted without ever losing its scale. Unlike other capitals, Hobart never outgrew its setting. It remained oriented toward the water, watched over by the mountain, and defined as much by restraint as by progress. From the edge of the city, the story continues through water. What shaped Hobart was never only the ground it stands on, but the river that anchored it. The Derwent begins far from streets and docks, rising quietly in the Central Highlands before descending through forests and valleys shaped by ice. By the time it reaches the city, it has widened into a deep tidal estuary, capable of drawing ships in from distant oceans. This sheltered reach determined where Hobart could exist, offering access, protection, and connection long before roads reached inland. Its banks once held uninterrupted forests, later cleared for settlement, whaling, and industry. Dams altered its flow, trade moved across its surface, and extraction left lasting marks, yet the river remained central to daily life, supplying water, defining movement, and fixing the city's horizon. Even now, the Derwent carries traces of loss and recovery. Whales, absent for nearly 2 centuries, have begun to return in winter, while rare species persist in its depths as fragile reminders that balance has not fully returned. The Derwent is not a backdrop to Hobart. It is the structure beneath it, a continuous line connecting mountain, city, and sea. Where the Derwent narrows, Hobart once believed it had solved a problem. A bridge stretched across the estuary, linking the western city to the eastern shore and turning water from a boundary into a passage. For many years, crossing the river became routine, its depth and tide reduced to something passed over each day without thought. That certainty collapsed in January 1975 when a bulk carrier struck the bridge in the darkness, sending concrete and steel down into the river. Cars drove into empty space before traffic could be stopped, and overnight the city was divided in two. The eastern shore was isolated, travel times stretched into hours, and ferries returned not as nostalgia, but as necessity. When the bridge was rebuilt, it came back stronger and altered, restoring movement but changing its meaning. The Tasman Bridge no longer stood as a symbol of certainty or control, but of recovery, a modern connection shaped by failure, and a reminder that in Hobart, even the most solid links must always negotiate with the river beneath them. The river is no longer simply crossed. Beyond the Tasman Bridge, Traveliam appears as a point of transition, not a place of expanding settlement, but where the flow itself becomes regulated. Here, what was once a continuous current begins to be divided according to use. Low hills and river valleys no longer function merely as natural extensions of the landscape, but as technical boundaries between free water and controlled water. Unlike the Tasman Bridge, Traveliam carries no immediately recognizable symbolism. It does not connect two shores, nor does it serve as a gateway. Instead, it exists as a quiet intermediate layer, a place where nature is still present, but has been absorbed into an operational system. The change here is not expressed through scale or form, but through function. The water continues to flow, yet no longer fully determines its own rhythm. Over time, this intervention becomes so familiar that it is almost invisible. But when the river's entire journey is considered, from the bridge that divides the city to the point where water is held and distributed, Traveliam marks a clear moment. From here onward, nature no longer operates alone. As you move further into southeastern Tasmania, the land begins to narrow, and places open to human intervention gradually fall away, giving way to a peninsula surrounded by the ocean on multiple sides. At the edge of this contraction, Cape Hoary appears less as a destination than as a natural ending. The path toward the headland winds through low forest and heath, then descends before opening into a final space where the land no longer slopes gently toward the sea, but stops with sudden finality. Here, vertical dolerite columns plunge straight into the constantly moving ocean, forming a clear boundary between what can stand firm and what never stands still. Cape Hoary does not feel wild in a chaotic sense. It follows its own order, shaped by rock, wind, and erosion repeated over long spans of time. There is no beach to rest on, no sheltered bay for refuge, only cliffs, open water, and space compressed between them. Standing at the cape, the view does not turn back toward the land. Instead, it is pulled outward, as everything behind recedes and the ocean takes full control of the frame. Cape Hoary does not tell a human story. It exists as a physical boundary where land ends and open space begins to dominate completely. What appears at Cape Hoary is not an isolated formation, but part of a larger pattern along Tasmania's southeastern edge. They extend, repeat, and harden into a continuous coastline where land gives way abruptly to the Southern Ocean. Tasman National Park takes shape not as a single place, but as the system that holds these edges together, a landscape of narrowing peninsulas, fractured headlands, and vertical stone where forests thin and soil gives way to rock. Here, vegetation clings close to the cliff line, movement is drawn outward toward open water, and the coastline resists settlement rather than inviting it. The park is defined less by what it contains than by where it stops. Cape Hoary is simply one exposed face of that larger structure, a point where the relationship between land and ocean becomes impossible to ignore. Tasman National Park preserves not a static landscape, but an ongoing process where wind, water, and gravity quietly redraw the boundary each year. Human presence passes through lightly here, never fully settling, while the coastline continues its long withdrawal into the sea, one fractured edge at a time. Tasmania was once a place designed for people to disappear, a fragment of land at the far edge of the world where nature itself replaced walls and the ocean became the final boundary. But as the chains fell away and the prisons faded into memory, the island did not erase its past. Instead, it allowed time to do what it has always done best, patiently returning the land to forests, the stone to the sea, and life to places once taken by human control. Over generations, Tasmania quietly transformed from a place of confinement into a refuge for nature's original rhythm, a reminder that power may endure for a moment, but only the wild is capable of lasting for thousands of years. And today, as the modern world continues to shrink the last remaining spaces for true wilderness, Tasmania stands not as a relic of history, but as a question for the future. Will humanity continue to conquer everything it reaches, or will it finally learn to slow down, listen, and allow life to exist on its own terms? At the edge of the world, Tasmania does not need to speak, because its silence already tells us everything worth preserving.